Italy, known for its wine, Vespas, upright architecture, and switchblades. The knife of choice for gangs, thugs, and a weapon of murder and crime. Except that none of that is true. We are going to be taking a look at the real story of the Italian Switchblade and everything you need to know about it. First off, what is an Italian Switchblade? Italian Switchblades take on a variety of shapes, but most are some variation of this shape, a double-edged or bayonet-ground blade with a push-button release. But it's really the mechanism that makes these knives special. By pressing the release button, the blade is kicked out and locked open. Looking down into the knife, you can see the kick spring that throws the knife out. The act of closing the knife will compress the spring back into the knife, storing the energy to open it later on. But with the spring applying a force to the blade constantly, how is the blade held closed? Notice how the blade has this little hole. A pin is inserted into that hole to hold it closed. The button on the switchblade is part of a teeter-totter mechanism. It naturally rests with the pin in the retaining position. When you push on the button, it picks the pin up out of the way and allows the blade to swing forwards. To lock the blade open, there is a nub on the spine of the blade and the back spring with a hole in it. The back spring drops down over the nub when the blade has rotated into position. In order to close the blade, you have to pick this spring up and release the nub, functioning as a pick-style knife. It's not the easiest thing to do, and pick locks have a reputation for breaking thumbnails. You can find that some examples have pull rings that assist in this process. Pick locks comprise the majority of early Italian switchblades, as well as those made in the golden era of switchblades. More on that later. Interestingly enough, this isn't actually a pick lock knife. This is actually the next evolution of the Italian switchblade, the swivel bolster. I can close it like a pick lock if I so desire, or I can press down on the bolster as such, and it will do the hard part for me. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get to the story of the Italian switchblade. Just like every other knife, it's impossible to pin down the exact genesis of the Italian switchblade. Examples of spring knives exist from the late 1700s and the 1800s, but never existed in quantity. What likely made these blades possible was the creation of improved and smaller springs by a clockmaker, Benjamin Huntsman, in 1742. Little more is known about the origin of switchblades until the 1900s. The switchblade, as we know it, begins in the town of Maniago. Maniago is a cutlery town, tracing its work back to the 1400s. In the late 1800s, a metal workers cooperative was formed to help the town compete with the larger names in the knife world, such as Solingen in Germany and Toledo in Spain. Then in 1907, Albert Marx arrived in Maniago. Albert Marx, unlike Karl Marx, was a businessman who already owned factories in Solingen. He helped solidify the knife cottage industry in Maniago, introducing more industrialized techniques, and established what would eventually become the Korakama Company. At this time, switchblades began to be seen in quantity, but not in massive numbers. The recognizable pick-lock switchblade had come into its own. But just as things were getting interesting, a problem arose. I'll give you a guess. It had two W's and a 2. World War II essentially brought switchblade production to a halt as Italian industry was converted to war materials. Production would not resume until the end of the war. Ironically enough, it was also World War II that would see to the prosperity of the Italian stiletto. GIs returning home from the war brought with them their new switchblades and introduced them to the United States. And thus, the beginning of the golden age of switchblades began. If you are enjoying this video, poke the like button. Now where was I? Right, Maniago, Marx, Korakama, World War II. American GIs returning from the war brought switchblades home and introduced the Italian switchblade to a new market, America. Demand for switchblades had never been particularly high in Italy, but Americans loved the blades. New Hollywood movies brought the knife further into the spotlight. Greasers, James Dean, and youth gangs were in the spotlight, and the switchblade was featured with them. These juvenile delinquent movies pushed sales even higher. Around this time, a gentleman named Jacob Polinkowski was attempting to obtain silk for his company, the Latin American Import-Export Company. The shorter name for this company? Latama. Polinkowski ended up stumbling into the cutlery trade, and upon finding a lucrative market, started working with the knife makers in Maniago to produce knives. Thus, the Latama switchblade came into being. Latama came to dominate the switchblade market. They were better than most other switchblades, made of better materials, and were able to scale up production to meet supply. This is why they were known as the Cadillac of knives. Numerous variations were made with blades ranging from 6 to 13 inches and various handle materials available. The Chris-style switchblades were introduced due to inspiration from the stories of Italian author Emilio Salgari. Now, a fact that makes this more interesting is that Latama is not a factory. In fact, the majority of Italian switchblade producers never made a knife themselves. Do you remember that cottage industry we discussed earlier in Maniago? The vast majority of switchblades were made by contract with the craftsmen of this and similar cottage industries. Almost every switchblade of this time was handmade through this cottage industry, checked for quality, and then stamped with the mark of the contracting business. Essentially, each switchblade was a semi-custom knife. There were a number of companies that made Italian switchblades. Mario, the company, not the plumber, accounted for the majority of switchblades during this time. Latama was the second largest producer, and there were others such as Korakama. Demand for switchblades remained high until 1954, when the golden age of switchblades came to a screeching halt. In the 1950s, Women's Home Companion published an article named "The Toy That Kills," written by Jack Harrison Pollock. Pollock had written a number of dramatic articles about social issues. The Toy That Kills called out the switchblade as a driving force in gang violence. A suspiciously unnamed judge is quoted in the article saying, "It's only a short step from carrying a switchblade to gang warfare." The article inflamed fears among increases in gang violence in the US cities. Newspapers and tabloids added to the dark reputation. While Hollywood movies had been great at driving up sales in the United States, they further sowed the seeds of fear of the Italian switchblade. In particular, the use of switchblades in the delinquent teenager movies generated a bad image among the public, drawing an eye to gang violence. In 1954, the state of New York became the first state to enact a ban on switchblades. The nail in the coffin was the 1958 Federal Switchblade Act, which ended the importation of switchblades into the United States and prohibited switchblades from interstate commerce. Latama and the other firms continued to export knives to Europe, but switchblades eventually experienced the same fate there as well. The golden age of switchblades had come to an end. Now the question is, should the switchblade have been banned? Was it really the loathsome weapon it was made out to be? I want to point out a couple of interesting facts here. If you look at a Latama catalog, the majority of Latama wares aren't switchblades. In fact, their switchblades comprised a small minority of Latama's business. More standard knives, such as chef's knives, were Latama's focus. The same is true of Korakama. Their actual factory in Maniago was dedicated to making scissors. Italian switchblades were never made as weapons or even as tools. They were novelties and pieces of art. You can see the imperfections of each knife revealing their handmade nature. Compare these knives to the combat blades of their time, or really any other time, and you will see a stark contrast in their construction. The use of stag or buffalo horn in a fighting knife is somewhat unlikely. In contrast to the high quality materials of the grips, the steel used for the blades was of poorer quality. This particular knife is made with 440C. It was the best quality steel I could find these knives in, and many were made with 440A steel or even worse. The craftsmen who made the knives often never hardened the blades, and many were never even sharpened. Odd choices for a weapon. As for their actual use in crime, there was very little evidence regarding their prominence in criminal activity. The two agencies that were to be tasked with enforcing the Federal Switchblade Act actually counseled against it. The real purpose of switchblade laws was to make politicians look good for being hard on crime, and incidentally, not preventing any crime. Some politicians actually agreed that they were only making a symbolic gesture. The takeaway is that the true story of the Italian switchblade is a tragedy, a handcrafted piece of art demonstrating the skill of its maker, framed for murder and made a pariah by society. An important aspect of the Federal Switchblade Act is that it doesn't actually prohibit anybody from owning a switchblade. That restriction is the prerogative of the states. Most states have either repealed or loosened their restrictions on switchblades, with a few exceptions such as New York. As a result, switchblades in general have been making a comeback. The Italian switchblade has been making a recovery as well. After 1980, Italian switchblades began to make their way back to the US as states began to roll back their restrictions. Today, demand for these knives has grown considerably, and some would even say that we are in a new silver age for switchblades. If you want to pick one up today, it is possible, but to make sure to check with your local laws. There is a lot more on the topic of Italian switchblades, such as other mechanisms like the swing guard and lever lock styles. Let me know in the comments if you want me to dig into these knives in future videos. If you want more info, check out the Switchblades of Italy. I'll have a link to it in the description. As always, stay safe and keep living the knife life.